My name's David Swanson. I'm the executive director of World Beyond War. We also have on this Zoom call with us Greta Zaro, our organizing director, and Mark Elliott Stein, our technology and social media director. And the two of them are not muted. The rest of you are, just because we're expecting hundreds of people and it gets to be chaos when everybody's not muted. Everybody should have access to the chat, and you can post questions and comments in the chat. And when Mark and Greta see something important there, they can interrupt me. Normally I do these presentations and I ask questions and I ask everyone to interrupt me all the time. What we're going to do this evening, because of this technology, is I'm going to make a presentation with some slides and some information, and then go to questions and conversation via the chat room. If you've checked out facebook.com/worldbeyondwar, this should be live streaming there, and Mark has said you can post questions and comments there as well. We also are recording this and it will be posted online on YouTube and elsewhere, and on the website of the Dallas Peace and Justice Center, as well as the website of World Beyond War. This was to be an in-person event in Dallas, Texas, and is being brought to you by the Dallas Peace and Justice Center, Pax Christi Dallas, Code Pink Dallas, and Veterans for Peace Dallas, and numerous great individuals there who are generously making this available to everyone. A woman named Mavis Belisle, who invited me to Dallas, also has the box of books that I shipped to Dallas for this event, and we'll be talking about how you can get those later on. We've got 225 people on here now, or 225 computers. I don't know if some of those are whole families. And rising, and I have posted a poll that at least some percentage of you can see, because 75 people or so have responded to it. And this is a poll that I like to start events with, so I have some sense of who I'm talking with. And for those of you who can't see it, you're not missing anything. I'll tell you what it says. It says, is war ever justified? And you have a choice of war is never, ever justified, which right now is at 78% of respondents. Or war is sometimes justified for some participants, which is sitting right at 22% of respondents. Or war is always the moral thing to do, which I am embarrassed to say not a single one of you has chosen yet. This response to this poll is about the reverse of what I would get at a typical real world event in the United States that wasn't very self-selected for people who wanted to end war. But this tells me that what we are going to be talking about this evening here, I don't know what it is in your time zone, is how you can talk to other people as much as how I can talk to you about the argument for ending all war and how to do it. So I'm going to end this poll and share some images with you on my screen. See if I can get rid of the poll. Greta, Mark, tell me if anything goes wrong, but hopefully you all are seeing a screen. Okay.
Looks good.
A screen that says ending war. So this is the poll we just took that I usually start with. You might be surprised, or you might not, that typically, and I think more so in the United States than in some other places I've been, almost everybody gives you the sometimes war is sometimes justified for some participants. And even with this group of self-selected people who are interested in this topic, we're at 22%. So we'll talk about how to address that. Here's another one. Humans just can't be rid of war, whether or not it's ever justifiable. So this is another belief that people will raise their hands and say in significant numbers. That is to say, I agree with you, war can never be justified, but it's simply going to happen. We can't stop it. We're powerless. There's nothing we can do to prevent war happening. And this is an interesting position because unlike the weather, war takes an incredible investment, incredible organization. It takes massive efforts to prepare for, to create the tools with which it's waged. And it has, even just in this country that I'm sitting in, $1 billion marketing arm. If it were simply going to happen, why do we have to put a couple of $1 trillion a year globally into making it happen and billions of dollars into convincing people it's okay for it to happen? Things that used to be inevitable. We like to talk about war as somehow being inevitable. I think as you go out and have conversations with people in your community or in your online community, as we are now, you run into this belief. But here's a list, just a very, very partial list of, in some cases, major parts of our cultures and societies that have been treated as inevitable, defended as inevitable, can't get rid of it because it's inevitable. You look at things like an all-male military. You now have the United States Congress looking at imposing a military draft on young women as a matter of equal rights for women. But if you can put women into militaries, why can't you take men out of militaries? Look at the safety of going outside your own house. In many parts of this world, up until some weeks back, that was pretty inevitable. Things can change. This is, what history tells you is that absolutely everything can and will change. The arguments that something is inevitable look very, very silly the more you look at history. Reasons why war is not inevitable. It's actually been absent from most of the existence of the human species, most of human prehistory. There's no evidence of anything resembling primitive warfare. I say primitive because it could not possibly have resembled current warfare. And there would be, but there isn't. It's been sporadic since its creation, since war really became significantly present just several thousand years ago. It's been very sporadic. It's, people will tell you there's always been a war somewhere. And there's always not been a war many, many, many somewheres. And there have been human societies that have not known war, have been incapable of comprehending war or murder. It is absolutely radically changed today from what it was just 50 years ago, or 100 or 200, which isn't even a blink in the history of the human species. And of course, most people do everything they can to avoid it. Even many of the biggest cheerleaders for war do everything they possibly can to avoid coming anywhere near a war. And most people who do come near a war, or even take part in a war from long distance, suffer from it, suffer physically and mentally from it. If you try to look up the number of cases of post-traumatic stress disorder, brain injury, moral injury, loss of limb, or suicidal tendencies that have resulted from war deprivation, globally, for all time, you get a grand total of 0. Nobody suffers from not having war. So it's, war is natural. Well, something that everybody suffers from and nobody misses. I don't know what natural means, but it's surely not that. Here's the percentage of humanity whose governments each spend a small fraction of what the US government does on war. and whose governments combined spend about what the US government does on war, and many of whose governments are close allies and weapons customers of the US government. So in the United States, where many of you may not live, but where I live, we're told that war is human, it's natural, it's part of humanity. And you have to ask, well, what about the other 96% of humanity? Because if the US government were just to move in the direction, right, every other government on earth is closer to zero than it is to the US military budget. If the US military budget were to move in that direction a little bit, you would see a reverse arms race, and it would be done by humanity. We wouldn't stop being human. Human nature does not exist. I'm very glad you all are muted, because this enrages people to say human nature does not exist. What do you mean? We're humans. We have nature. We have human nature. Yeah, but nobody ever uses the phrase human nature to refer to things that we actually all have in common. Nobody says hunger or thirst or the need for sleep or the desire for sex, or nobody uses human nature to refer to the need for oxygen. Human nature is a phrase that's used almost exclusively to refer to things that one wants to defend against people who want to eliminate them or change them, and knowing damn well that they could. And in order to prevent them, you say, no, it's human nature. Slavery is human nature, say slave owners. War is human nature, say war makers. It's rhetoric. It's not science. It doesn't refer to something. You can't slice open a cadaver and find, oh, there's the human nature. It's not something that actually exists. Here are countries with no standing armies. Many of them quite small, but many of them showing an example of how you can benefit from not having a standing army. Places like Costa Rica that have done so well in many ways. There's a film you can find in the events resources section of the World Beyond War website called A Bold Peace that tells this story of Costa Rica, and other materials tell the story of these other countries. I'm often told, well, maybe you could end war, but you couldn't do it until you ended this other evil thing first that's related to war or that causes war. You can't end war without ending capitalism. Well, why not? You had war long before you had capitalism. You have capitalist countries that make war and capitalist countries that don't, capitalist countries that make war more than others. Why in the heck couldn't you? Racism, carnivorism, environmental destruction. War contributes to all of these things. They all contribute to war. There are patterns that overlap. You can describe the themes that embrace all of these practices, and we would have a much larger movement and be more powerful and succeed more quickly. So in political terms, it's better to try to end all of these things, to try, as Dr. Martin Luther King said, to end racism and extreme materialism and militarism together as one evil. But you don't have to. And so we don't have to put off the peace movement until we succeed in some other movement. We need to build a broader movement that encompasses a vision that corrects a number of evil practices. If war were necessary, couldn't it be launched without the lies? This also strikes me as rather significant when you're talking about war being inevitable and war being needed, because most people who say it's inevitable actually say it's necessary to defend a country, to destroy tyranny, to spread democracy, whatever. It's necessary for some reason. I looked at wars around the world and back through the millennia and wrote a book called War is a Lie, and I couldn't find a war. To start thinking about this now, or posting in the chat now your favorite war that you think is not based on lies, because I couldn't find a war that wasn't based on lies. Often a very different set of lies to launch it, from those to maintain it, from those to escalate it, from those concocted long after it was over to defend it historically, but lies. Every single war. Why do we need not only propaganda, but really dishonest presentations of wars if they're necessary? If we need a war, tell us why. Explain it to us. You know, we're not necessarily such idiots that you can't tell us the reason. Can the fact that politicians are openly proposing that people be sacrificed to coronavirus for profits help us to recognize that equally evil motivations drive military foreign policy? This seems like a teachable moment, as they say, when you have politicians here in this country and elsewhere talking about the needs of the economy, when the impact on the stock market is higher up in the newspapers than the impact on human lives, when you have people encouraging others to go to work or to go vote in Wisconsin, as they did in the state of Wisconsin today. Go ahead and risk spreading a deadly disease to yourselves and others, but get the economy moving. When you see the casualness with which elected officials do that, can it become easier, despite the patriotism, the flag waving, the war music, the war hype, the demonization of the foreign enemy, can it become easier to recognize how evil the motivations are that drive military foreign policies, that use war as a tool of politics? If Joe Biden, for example, didn't back a war on Iraq in order to avoid a war on Iraq, as is his latest claim, what did he back it for? Well, he backed it for political reasons, electoral reasons, reasons related to the profits of the oil industries and the war industries. He backed it out of subservience to the officials and the party that he's part of and their funders in a corrupt political system. I hope you can see this whole slide at the top, but it says nonviolence denial is as dangerous as climate denial. And what I mean by this is that if you refuse to accept the facts, the growing body of historical evidence that shows us that nonviolent approaches to conflict are more successful and far longer lasting than violent ones, you're engaging in a sort of denial that's as dangerous to human life as denial of the evidence on the collapse of the Earth's climate. The part at the bottom of this slide is what happened in Germany 1920, 1923, Algeria 1961, Czechoslovakia 1968, Soviet Union 1991. I should make sure I'm reading all of these, I guess, because some people are joining us by telephone and can't see the slides. What happened in these places and others is nonviolent movements, nonviolent rejections of coup attempts, nonviolent rejections of foreign occupations. And there are countless examples, and they're not taught in schools. Pop quiz, you can't do it except in the chat, and Mark and Greta can tell me later what you all think, but I'll go through these pop quizzes anyway. What tends to be present where wars are begun? Choice A, resource scarcity. Wars happen where people have to fight over scarce resources. Human rights violations in need of response. We get this every time a war is marketed to us on television, right? We need to have a war because there's human rights being violated. So presumably wars would be happening wherever human rights are being violated. Or choice C, raw fossil fuels. And there are numerous others we could put on the list, but the only one for which there is evidence, where studies have found a real correlation, is the fossil fuels. Wars are far more likely to happen where there's oil, where there's gas, which is not what they like to tell you, at least not what they used to like to tell you. Now they sort of openly admit it. Here's another myth: if war is beneficial, why are its victims so ungrateful? This is another problem with war propaganda in countries that wage wars far away. They're told that the victims are grateful, and you can look back at polls over the past couple decades of in the United States, for example, finding that people in Iraq benefited from the destruction of Iraq, whereas the United States itself suffered, but Iraqis aren't grateful enough, and so forth. Well, if you look at polls that were done in 2013, 2014 of some 65 countries around the world, you found it with the question, what nation is the greatest threat to peace on earth? The big winner globally is the United States, which is just absolutely incomprehensible to most people in the United States, because it's, of course, doing all of these things to benefit the rest of the world. It's just unthinkable that the United States could be causing harm. There's a tweet this past week or two from the United States National Security Council applauding and urging the global ceasefire proposed by the United Nations Secretary General, and listing a number of countries where the United States is fighting wars, where everyone should abide by the global ceasefire. The explanation for which, of course, I think, is that a US official thinks that all such laws and proposals and ideas for improving behavior apply to all other countries, not to the United States. So the Afghans should stop fighting, not the United States in Afghanistan. The Libyans should stop fighting, not the United States in Libya, and so forth. I don't think the idea even occurred to whoever tweeted that. Here's some statistics. If 2.2 million people die of coronavirus in the United States, and huge numbers in many other countries around the world, that would be 0.6% of the people in the United States, which would compare to 5% of the people in Iraq killed by violence. Just in the years following 2003, violence in excess of the already high death rate created by the previous war and the sanctions and the bombings that were going on before 2003, 5%. And it would compare to 0.3% of people in the US killed in World War II. So the biggest tragedy in US history, textbooks and courses and popular culture, World War II, killed 0.3% of the people in the United States. The coronavirus could, high-end predictions, kill twice that many. Now, here's where I do a magic trick. It will be less impressive than usual because you all can't shout out your answers. But if you said, when we started this in that poll, if you said that some wars are sometimes justified, I'd like you to think of the name of one such war and shout it out, or post it in the chat, and I'll go back and look at the chat and see what you all posted and see if you came up with anything other than this one, because almost everybody says World War II. Nobody cares that there were no wars in prehistory, or there's nothing in our biology to cause wars, or every war of the past several decades has been a disgrace. The only thing anybody cares about is World War II. And as you go out and talk to other people about ending war and taking steps toward ending war, I hope this doesn't happen to you, but be prepared for it. They will all almost immediately start demanding, what about Hitler, what about Hitler, what about Hitler? And so it's important to have at least the beginnings of an outline to how to respond to that. We're putting together an online course just on talking about World War II for the end of 2020. So watch for that at World Beyond War. But it's important to recognize that this is the single worst thing to happen to humanity in any short period of time. The most death, the most suffering, the most environmental destruction, economic destruction, societal destruction, the greatest damage. And when I say to people, well, why World War II? Why would you say that? Again, 99.9% of them will say Holocaust, death camps, etc. But of course, those killed several million people, and World War II killed several tens of millions of people. So it's a very strange cure for the disease. It's also worth recognizing to what extent World War II was a continuation of World War I, which almost nobody ever tries to defend World War I. It's hardly glorified at all in Western culture. It's by and large ignored. And it's interesting that not only was it the US military that took the Spanish flu to the trenches of World War I, from which it spread to the world, including Spain, where it was permissible to print negative stories in the newspaper, and thus it became called the Spanish flu as punishment for reporting on it. But when troops came back with the Spanish flu from Europe to the United States, they were supposed to go and have pro-war parades to raise money for the war. And cities were competing who could raise the most. And the doctors were saying, prior to this huge parade in Philadelphia, don't do it. You'll spread this disease. And the politicians, sort of rehearsing for recent weeks, and what we've seen from today's politicians, we're saying, let's just advise everyone not to sneeze or cough. That will handle it. Well, of course, the doctors were right. They held the pro-war parade in Philadelphia. It spread like mad, and it spread very likely, most historians and doctors now conclude, to a guy named Woodrow Wilson, the president of the United States, who had promised the whole stinking world that at the end of the war, he was going to go negotiate the Treaty of Versailles in Paris and make it fair and restrain the vengeance of the French and the British and not create another war. And he went to Paris and he lay sick and dying in bed through the whole negotiation of the treaty, which came out as a disaster and had smart people predicting World War II on the spot. So World War II came out of particular acts of stupidity and human weakness that were by no means necessary. It also wasn't a surprise to the United States military, to the United States government. That we can talk in detail as you want about that propaganda effort. It also had absolutely nothing to do with what's been sold to most people as the humanitarian defense. I have, if you can't see the slide, I have this picture of Evian bottled water, which of course comes from Evian, France, which was the big news story of the month at a particular time back in '38, and was one of the bigger of these conferences that were held around the world leading up to and right through the course of World War II, where the world's governments decided openly, publicly, and shamelessly that they wouldn't take any of the Jews from Germany because they didn't like Jews. Just shamelessly anti-Semitic agreement with Hitler, who was claiming he wanted to put them all on luxury cruise ships and send them anywhere. And nobody would take them. And peace activists were appealing to the US and British and other governments right through the course of the war, take them out. And they weren't being told it can't be done. They weren't being told we can't negotiate with Germany. They were being told we have no interest in that. Right, and of course there were no military steps taken. There were no bombing of the concentration camps or the tracks leading to them. And of course the King of Saudi Arabia was at that very time demanding that the United States not be part of sending too many Jews to Palestine, where a pipeline was planned. So not exactly a stellar record in terms of moral conduct in World War II. The troops who participated, 80% of them didn't fire their guns because it's not easy to fire a gun at someone. You have to be conditioned, as modern militaries have learned to condition people to do it mindlessly. People, of course, have not been conditioned to handle having done it, but they've been conditioned to do it. Not back then. They weren't. World War II brought us total war, ended this notion of wars being, the primary victims being participants. The primary victims have been civilians for World War II and almost every war since. The Nazi and eugenics roots in U.S. law and U.S. segregation and U.S. science and so forth are not part of the good and evil story we're told. And of course, the good war phrase for World War II and this story of World War II as the good war was really magnified during the war on Vietnam, or what the Vietnamese call the American War. And I think because we saw something similar that makes me think this is why, during the wars on Iraq and Afghanistan, people who opposed the war on Iraq, including people like Barack Obama, loved to say, but I'm for the war on Afghanistan. And you had even peace activists convincing themselves that everything that was wrong with the war in Iraq was right with the war on Afghanistan. And this whole, I think you have a majority of people in the world who imagine that the war on Afghanistan was authorized by the United Nations, for example, even though it never happened. And I think it's because when you oppose one war, you're supposed to pick out another war to support so that you don't convey the idea that you're some sort of loony who opposes all war. And of course, I think the only sane position any human being can hold right now is to oppose all war, and we have to make that a respectable position, and I'll talk about that more. And of course, in many ways, World War II has yet to end, right? Where do the taxes that US taxpayers love to hate come from? Where did the big government with all the spending, where did the permanent military and the foreign military bases around the world, where did these come from? World War II, but they haven't gone away. The troops haven't even left Germany or Japan. But here's the last item on this slide. But if you agree with me, as many of you said you did at the beginning in this poll, if you agree with me and if your neighbors agree with us that no war can possibly be justified going forward in this completely different age, completely different system of international law and nuclear weaponry and climate collapse, that you can't have a war now, well, then I couldn't possibly care less what you think of World War II. The point is, what do you think going forward, right? We have people who can't let go of the US Civil War as this wonderful force of goodness that ended slavery. And we could talk about to what extent it actually ended slavery and how else you might have ended slavery and how most of the world ended slavery, but they won't let go of that. And I don't care. I don't care as long as they don't think the way we change society now, the way we end mass incarceration or we end environmental destruction, is to first pick out a bunch of fields and kill millions of young people and then pass a new law. As long as we're all together on we just jump straight to passing the law and we skip picking out fields and killing large numbers of young people, well, then I don't care anymore what you think of the US Civil War. But we have to understand that we've moved beyond that we can honor the dead and we can appreciate the heroics of the dead, but we, like it or not, we've advanced as a society, at least those of us on this call, and we don't need to do things that way anymore. There's a slide, if you can't see it, that says, who is this guy? And it has a picture of of course, as many of you may know, Smedley Butler. And if you don't know Smedley Butler, find out about him. Too long a story to go over now, but a U.S. general who was a wonderful advocate for peace after retirement. And he said in a speech at the University of Virginia, near where I'm sitting, "Have you ever heard a leader roundly condemned for preserving peace?" And he liked to point out the popularity of peace as opposed to war. And this is the perversity of what the World War II mythology has done to us. It's demonized. It's made it possible to denounce choosing peace. Choosing peace can be denounced as appeasement, as evil giving in to war, rather than promoting an alternative to war. And so we have to develop this understanding of the nonviolent alternatives to wars, the ways to avoid creating wars, which have to be very, very carefully created, so that we can understand peace as making peace, not as making war, the way it used to be understood. Here's a quote: "No war by any nation in any age has ever been declared by the people." Most people don't know who said that. You can post in the chat who said it and claim credit afterwards, but it was Eugene Debs. And here's a pop quiz. The U.S. sells or gives weapons to or trains or funds the military of this percentage of the most oppressive governments on earth: 12%, 52%, or 96%. And of course, as I go through these presentations, people start to catch on that it's always the worst number. But for this one, a lot of people get it wrong. It is, in fact, 96%. I've just put out a book called 20 Dictators Currently Supported by the U.S., where I picked out 20 dictatorships from among 50 oppressive governments, many of them not dictatorships. But looking at those 50, and looking at numerous studies including studies funded by the U.S. government and approved of by the U.S. government, for which are the most oppressive governments in the world. I come up with this list of 50, and 48 of them, 96%, are armed or trained or funded by the U.S. military. So you have this bizarre situation where Donald Trump meets with a North Korean dictator and is just denounced for daring to do such a thing. And you have Bernie Sanders just condemned on everyone's televisions for saying something less than 100% negative about Cuba. And yet every dictatorship on earth, with a handful of exceptions that are all designated enemies, that are all being threatened with war or sanctions or being sanctioned, the United States is arming or funding or training or more than one of those things. So it's very, very strange relationship to dictatorships in public conversation versus reality. So we want a future without zombie ideas. This is what I talked about earlier. If you agree about the future, we can put the past behind us. But there are still millions and millions of people who think that you can justify a war in the future. And so here's a short case for why you can't. And we start with this notion that war is a last resort, right? Because even when wars are glorified and celebrated and cheered for, and the presenters on TV are just gushing about the newest bombs, it's still claimed to be a last resort. And yet it's always a first resort. It's always carefully maneuvering into a war. You never hear about second resorts or third resorts or 5,678,995th resorts. It's this notion that, well, if they're doing it, they must have tried everything else. No, if they're doing it, they must have carefully avoided everything else. It's not actually that easy to get into a war. And I wrote a book little while back about just war theory, this vestige of ancient worldviews in which killing a Christian was doing them a great favor, and killing a non-Christian was absolutely meaningless. Mark, are you seeing those red scribbles on the screen?
Yes, I am.
Uh,
And I don't know what to do, but why don't you just go on, David?
If they amount to no more than that, we will continue and assume that someone is creatively contributing to our analysis of just war theory. So this is, you know, I wrote this book called War is Never Just, and I sent it with friends to the meetings they were having at the Vatican in Rome, where the cardinal was trying to get the new pope to really come out formally against just war theory. And they came back and said, you know, people from poor countries around the world have never heard of just war theory. Whereas, of course, in US universities and in European culture, it's commonplace and it's moral and it's serious and solemn and it's the way to do war, right? It's, you know, we don't have just ways to do rape or child abuse or many other things. There are things we think we should just abolish, but with war, we have the way to do it just, right? And so you create these criteria. War must be launched by a proper authority, must be proportional, etc. And I couldn't find any criteria that weren't either immeasurable, just invented out of thin air, impossible, that is to say you couldn't do them if you tried, or amoral, having nothing to do with morality. And beyond that, what really struck me was that even if you could impossibly have a war that met all the criteria for just war theory and was going to somehow magically do more good than harm, and everyone was going to say, oh, thank goodness we had that war, it would still have to justify having spent all these decades investing trillions of dollars into preparing for that war, and all of the unjust wars that everybody agrees have been unjust wars over the years, waiting for that one just war to come along. And in fact, apart from the wars, it's just the budget of the militaries that kills far more than any of the wars or all the wars put together, right? The biggest weapon, the most deadly weapon is the pocketbook, is the accounting sheet, is the spending of the money. You can take 3% of $1 trillion and end starvation on Earth, and you got the world spending $2 trillion on wars and preparations for war. The institution of war does tremendous damage in terms of those resources, in terms of threatening our environment. You know, the Western militaries, like the US military, claim to be defending their little corner of the earth. And of course, the vast bulk of the environmental damage they do, the territories just poisoned for eternity, and the landmines never picked up, and the bombing and devastation and cancers are in the places where they wage the wars. But those militaries are still the top destroyers of the environments back home. The US military is a top poisoner of US waters, top, you know, distributor of these permanent, never go away PFAS chemicals. The vast majority of what the US government calls Superfund environmental disaster sites, the big environmental disasters, they're military bases. You know, so it's a major destroyer of the environment. Erodes our liberties. Every war for freedom, we lose more freedoms, lose them first for enemies and then for everybody else. Big promoter of bigotry, fueled by bigotry, but fuels bigotry in a vicious cycle, endangers us. You know, you have a war on terrorism, predictably increases terrorism. You have numerous top military officials just after they retire proclaiming how they've been doing more harm than good. You know, so it's not that, oh, we can scale back military spending and still be safe. No, we need to scale back military spending in order to be safer, because it's endangering us. It's impoverishing us. Well, at least there's all those jobs, right? At least there's all those jobs. No, there's not all those jobs. I mean, there are, but the same dollars spent otherwise, the same dollars returned to working people or spent on education or spent on green energy, produce more jobs, better paying jobs in some cases. War is, of course, hideously immoral. Is a top threat to life and health in the places where it happens. And so it's the institution. It's not just the particular wars, although it's them, that we have to end. Looks like those red scribbles are staying with us, but I don't think they really do much damage. And I'm guessing they were a well-intended accident by somebody, or we would have seen more of them.
Strange.
So this is a graphic, those of you who can see it, and I'll describe it to everyone else, that was produced by ICANN, which, if you don't know ICANN, you should find out and support them. This is a group, Nobel Peace Prize winning group, behind the new treaty to ban nuclear weapons. Well, I take it back. There's more lines. Do me a favor and don't scribble on your screen, please. And don't test things if you don't know what they do. Much appreciated. So what this graphic shows, $35 billion as an annual cost just in the United States for nuclear weapons. You could instead have all of these: 300,000 beds in intensive care, 35,000 ventilators, 150,000 nurses, 75,000 doctors, which seems to have more to do with defending people from an actual threat. So here's an alteration I've done to this graphic. Annual global military spending, approximated very roughly at $2 trillion. You could have all of these things, not one of them, but all of them together. 17,100,000 beds in intensive care, nearly 2 million ventilators, 8.5 million nurses, 4.2 million doctors. Now, there's a couple ways to look at this question of avoiding war or avoiding peace. One is to recognize the extent to which those who have launched wars go out of their way to avoid peace, make extreme efforts to avoid peace. Hey, thanks, whoever got rid of the lines, maybe Mark. Look back at US wars like Mexico, Spanish American, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Iraq. Always, there's this great opportunity to avoid. There's an offer on the table. There's a negotiation proposed. There's, options that just have to be rejected. Peace agreements that have to be rejected in order to get a war started. On the other hand, when people say to me, well, you don't want to have a war on Yemen, what do you want to have instead? What do you want to replace it with? And my gut response is, well, just not a war on Yemen. Just don't have it. You know what? I need to replace it with something. But in fact, the structures of our society have to be replaced because they drive us towards war. Our communication systems, our government systems, our funding systems for our governments, unless we change the systems and structures and the culture that we live in, people are going to go on making these extreme efforts to create wars. Unless we initiate a reverse arms race, unless we make international law a reality, and democracy and aid and cooperation and diplomacy and unarmed civilian peacekeeping the norm rather than armed peacekeeping or armed war making, unless we develop a culture of peace, unless we get rid of exceptionalism and develop humanism and use we and our and us to mean humanity, we're going to go on having this problem. So here's another quiz. What percentage of the top 4 weapons dealing nations are permanent members of the UN Security Council? Now, I already gave away that it's always the worst answer. 0, 25, 50, or 100%. It is, of course, 100%. How can you have a body created to end the scourge of war that gives special veto power over anything to top weapons dealers and top war makers. We need democratic reform or replacement. What can we do? What can we do and what can we tell other people to do when we start to understand the need to move in this direction and to reverse the direction that governments and militaries, to a great extent, even during this coronavirus crisis, are still moving? Well, one initiative that's on the table that we can promote is a global ceasefire, which has a very long way to go, but is a wonderful proposal. And if you go to WorldBeyondWar.org, you can find a list, you can find a petition to sign and tools to use, and a list that we're updating constantly of what nations are saying about their relationship to a global ceasefire. And you can add there for us to incorporate into the list any information you can find out about your government or others. Other proposals that can be advanced: reverse arms races, closing of foreign bases, closing of domestic bases for that matter, but we're working in some coalitions with allies and with allies at particular foreign bases on trying to close foreign military bases that belong to any country on earth. But of course, the vast bulk of foreign military bases belong to the United States government. Advancing international law, supporting international law, advancing aid and diplomacy. We have a campaign trying to move 3% of military spending to anti-hunger work. Advancing unarmed peacekeeping, supporting organizations like Nonviolent Peace Force and others that do it. Developing a culture of peace, which is what we're doing on this call and what we do with all the resources we provide at World Beyond War. Curing exceptionalism. I won't talk about this at length because I want to get to questions and conversation here, but another book I've written recently is called Curing Exceptionalism. Preventing and ending particular wars. It's important to recognize that this can be done and is done and has been done many times, and that in fact, the big push in the United States government for a war on Iran has been stopped in its tracks just before starting a number of times. And we don't get holidays on the calendar celebrating that, but we should. They're the only war holidays we should get. Divestment is a campaign that World Beyond War and some of our allies are working on in global and local coalitions. Something we had some success with here in my town of Charlottesville, Virginia. I got together a coalition and we got the city council to take its money out of weapons and fossil fuels in one resolution that made the links between those two things. And then there's a pension fund that the city has also, and now I got myself made a member of the city board that works on that. And it looked like we were just getting somewhere, and then we stopped having meetings because of the coronavirus. So we'll see where that goes. But Greta Zaro, who's on this call, has been a big part of our divestment campaign, and we've got lots of resources and can talk to you about how it's been done and where it's succeeded and how it's something that will really have an impact in its entirety. The more places that do it, the bigger the impact. It's easy to dismiss one little place doing it. Conversion. We can talk about how to work on converting war industries to peaceful industries and the economic benefits and the finances available to do studies of the economic benefits, etc. And of course, education. A lot of what I was just talking about the systems we need to rework, are in a book that World Beyond War has produced called A Global Security System, An Alternative to War. And we've produced other books and lots of materials and have links to resources from many of you and others that help educate the public about history and about the future. Well, we don't necessarily need our predictions or optimism or pessimism. Those of you who are just hooked on optimism, go for it. I'm not going to try to break your addiction, but I really have no use for it. What we need is activism It's more inspiring. It's more enjoyable. It's what others will imitate, and then we will succeed. And so World Beyond War is, of course, a place where I'm the executive director. Roots Action at rootsaction.org is another organization I work for. It does online work on war and peace and many other issues. Education, divestment, bases campaign, lobbying, protesting, coalition building, chapter forming. And people will say, well, forming a coalition around abolishing all war, that's going to be harder than just abolishing one weapon or ending one particular war. Not necessarily. We've actually had some good luck building some coalitions around ending all war, including with groups that are not focused on peace, but are focused on other issues, because it's a coherent, honest, understandable position to go after the entire industry of war and to go after it for environmental reasons and judicial reasons and reasons related to poverty and education and racism and so forth. It's actually a way that opens up opportunities to build a certain kind of coalition. Here's another quote: "When I rise, it will be with the ranks, not from the ranks." Again, Eugene Debs. And here, coming to the end here is a declaration of peace that has been signed in almost every country on earth. And if you haven't signed it, please sign it and please share it with others. You can find it at WorldBeyondWar.org. And for those of you on the phone, it says, "I understand that wars and militarism make us less safe rather than protect us, that they kill, injure, and traumatize adults, children, and infants, severely damage the natural environment, erode civil liberties, and drain our economies, siphoning resources from life-affirming activities. I commit to engage in and support nonviolent efforts to end all war and preparations for war, and to create a sustainable and just peace." So you can sign this at the WorldBeyondWar.org website as an individual or as an organization. Please only sign it as an organization you are authorized to sign on behalf of. And please share it with others. And when you sign it, you'll see a bunch of check boxes. You don't have to check any of them, but it's helpful if you do, indicating what interests you and what doesn't, and how you'd like to be involved in trying to end all war. I mentioned earlier that I shipped a big box of books to Dallas. I don't know what percentage of you are actually in Dallas and what percentage of you are spread around the world, but you can get any of these books for the same deal that I was going to offer people in Dallas, whether or not you're in Dallas. And if you are in Dallas, Mavis Belial will try to get them to you without coming dangerously close to you. She'll leave them on your doorstep. If you're anywhere else, I'll get them to you by mail. But these are books you can find at davidswanson.org/books. They include War is a Lie, which is a guide to help you spot war lies. They include the Peace Almanac, which we've produced at World Beyond War, that gives you a historical lesson or story from that day of the year for each of the 365 days of the year. Curing Exceptionalism. This is a US focused book, but how the US can stop thinking of itself as above the rest of the world. When the World Outlawed War. This is a story of the peace movement really around the world, but especially in the United States and Europe in the 1920s, and a treaty that was produced called the Kellogg-Briand Pact that banned war and still does. War is Never Just, relating to just war theory, which I mentioned. 20 dictators currently supported by the US. This is my new book with 20 characters who would just be wonderful propaganda if the United States government were targeting them with wars, if wars were really motivated by attacking dictators. In fact, these are dictators whose militaries are armed and funded and trained by the US military. And I think 14 out of the 20 actually have military backgrounds, these dictators, and 8 of them graduated from Western military schools in the United States, in England, and in one case, Spain. The sky blue scarves, you know, taking the lead from our friends in Afghanistan, we encourage everyone to wear sky blue scarves, showing that we all live under the same blue sky, and that we want to abolish war. And so you can go to davidswanson.org/donate and donate $20 and tell me which of any of these things you want sent to you. Or $30 for any two of these things that you want sent to you. And the delivery method may be different if you're in Dallas, but no matter what, we'll get it to you. So let's do another poll before we take questions, or while we're taking questions. And this is roughly the same question as before. That is, are you more inclined now, even if you were inclined before, to believe that we can or should or must end all war than you were when we got here? And, or do you think with more time, maybe even in the next hour as we continue, that you could be moved in that direction? Or do you think, if you're already on board but others aren't, do you think others not on this call can be moved in the right direction with the right information? So I'm going to stop sharing this and create a poll for you all. And those of you who see it, great. Those of you who don't see it, it just asks what I just said. The 3 of you the 10 of you who've already voted are clearly seeing it. So I'll report on the responses to the poll after a while, when I'm sure everybody that wants to vote and is able to vote has voted. Let me go to Greta or Mark for any comments or questions or stuff from the chat.
Yeah, we have a lot of great comments and questions, David. Thank you so much for your presentation. I think the first question I'd like to start with is the question of, how would you define war? What is your definition of war? And related to that, do you include defensive attacks in your definition of war? Like if you're using self-defense, for example.
Defensive attacks is a very interesting phrase. Well, for a definition of war, I'm not picky, and I've seen many, and I'm fine with many of them, and different ones can be useful for different purposes. But let's say large, organized violence, typically by a government, whether or not it's recognized as a government by what they call the international community, but mass violence by a military organized by a government is typically what I call war. And I call that war not because I think sanctions are wonderful humanitarian blessings and I don't oppose sanctions. Not because I think, an individual drone murder is good, noble police work, but because I think we have to distinguish war in order to talk about it, and I'm actually not a big fan of the incredible use of the war metaphor, that the war on poverty, the war on drugs, the war on this, the war on that. I think we should get away from it, and I think I've been a promoter of and love this sort of shift to thanking doctors and nurses and health workers for their service. But this video I've seen out of the UK saying the doctors have gone to war and there are new war heroes, I'd actually prefer we get away from that. That war metaphor that so dominates our thinking. It dominates our medical thinking in some ways. Do I include defensive attacks in wars? Well, yes. I mean, when peace activists created this ban on war that I mentioned in the Kellogg-Briand Pact back in 1928, they intentionally avoided banning aggressive war because they assumed, for good reason, that everybody was always going to claim they were the defensive war and the other guy was the aggressive war maker. And that if you were going to ban war, you just had to ban war. The analogy being to dueling. You had banned dueling as a settlement of individual disputes, and you didn't just ban aggressive dueling and keep humanitarian dueling and so forth. You banned dueling as a backward barbaric practice. You are going to have to do the same thing with war. And of course, you then have to have an answer to the people who say, but I just want to innocently defend myself with war, and I can't do that until the other guy bans war first, then I'll ban war happily. Unless I'm afraid that he might quickly stop banning war, so I can't, you have to address that. And one way you address it, I think, is with education around the power of nonviolence and the great extent to which over the past century, nonviolence has proved far more effective than war at ending tyranny domestically and even occupations by foreign forces, and that those victories have been far longer lasting and done less damage in the process, and so forth, combined with a realization of what governments that talk about defensive war actually do, right? I mean, if you wanted the United States, for example, to have defensive missiles on its borders and so forth, but get rid of bases thousands of miles away and aircraft carriers and weapons in outer space and so forth, if you wanted to have a so-called Defense Department that only had weapons that could be used defensively, not aggressively, well, then you'd be talking about scaling back the vast majority of that military. And even just taking a step in that direction, I promise you, would start a reverse arms race that would make going further in that direction more palatable to many more people. And so then we could really start talking about what it means to engage in collective nonviolent defense, what it means for a country to be occupied that refuses to be occupied. If people know how to nonviolently refuse to be occupied, they're not occupied, right? And so yes, of course, we have to talk about war, whether or not it's described as defensive and whether or not it really is defensive, right? You talk about a war like a US war on Iraq, thousands of miles away, and the US claims it's defensive, absolute nonsense. But the Iraqis claim it's defensive, a pretty darn good case, right? They've been attacked. And it's not the place of someone sitting in the United States which attacked them to tell them what to do. But when friends of mine in countries that the United States has attacked ask me what I think, I point them to the evidence around the power of nonviolence and what it can do.
Thanks, David. A follow-up question to defining what is war. Someone else has asked, how would you define militarism, and how does the term militarism differ from the term war?
Great question. Not a common one. Let me just point out the responses to this poll first and delete it. 90% say, and it's been shrinking. It was higher, but it's down now to 90% say they're more inclined than when we got here an hour ago to agree that we must end all war, etc. And 10% say no, they're not. Some of those 10% may be because they already knew everything when we got here. Some of them may be because I've not said anything that's convinced them yet. Who knows? Oh, here's a share results button. Let me try and see what that does. Can you all see the poll results now? Yes, I think you can. Well, anyway, I don't know if you need to. Anyway, those were the results. And the question, militarism. Well, and the reason that I do that poll is because even after I do that poll, even with groups where they came in 90% saying some wars are sometimes justified and then went out 90% saying we must end all war, I'll still get a question in the question and answer period along the lines of, but you know, you can't really change anyone's mind. You know, facts have no bearing. You know, people only operate on emotion, and it's just, if you can influence somebody emotionally, maybe you can get them to think they agree with you for a minute, but not really. You can't really change anyone's mind. And so, and people will say this even after having just done that poll where 90% of the people in the room, including themselves, just said they'd change their mind. So that's sort of the purpose. Militarism is not something I've defined before, and I've not been asked the question before, but I think that it encompasses, or one definition could be encompassing both the culture that's the opposite of a culture of peace, and the systems, the structural systems that are the opposite of a world structured for peace. That is, if you're funding militaries and preparing battle plans and avoiding treaties and treaty obligations and international courts and preparing for war structurally, and if you have a culture that adores war, that builds up wonderful stories about World War II nonstop, that thanks for their service, not the doctors and the nurses and the food workers and all the people we actually depend on, but declares that weapons makers, as the US government has just done this, weapons makers are essential. Farm workers are not essential. I'm sorry, what I'm inclined to say to that cannot be printed or articulated on a friendly family webinar like this, but farm workers are essential. Building missiles is not essential, right? So this is a culture of militarism that we have to move away from. And obviously in other contexts, you could say somebody is being militaristic about this or that, but I think the culture of war and the structure of war together are militaristic.
Okay. David, I'm going to come in with a few questions from Facebook.
Okay.
So Jonathan Valot has been chatting from Ireland, and he writes, police are unarmed in Ireland. We advocate global nuclear disarmament and don't have a culture of exceptionalism, don't have foreign military bases. Our tiny army only does humanitarian aid and disaster relief. Got to get US warplanes out of Shannon Airport, though. So that certainly is a message that strikes home with us. Do you want to just say a few words about what we've done with Ireland, David?
Well, we have lots of friends and allies in Ireland and had a great global conference. We have a conference every year called No War, whatever the year is. So No War 2018, we had a conference in Limerick, Ireland. And Ireland doesn't have foreign military bases outside of Ireland, but Ireland does have a foreign military base inside of Ireland in Shannon Airport, and has a structural system and cultural system in which it is extremely difficult to get into the Irish media opposition to that foreign military base, effectively a foreign military base that the US military has made this civilian airport at Shannon. And impossible, literally impossible. We tried to purchase billboards anywhere in Ireland that we tried, advertising opposition to that use of that airport, etc. We found, you know, a wonderful culture of peace and history of nonviolence, an understanding of heroic and noble resistance to past wars and of assistance in peacemaking by other countries in Ireland when we were there, but still a disturbing level of acceptance of war and of the idea within the Irish government and the Irish public, as in other countries. acceptance of the idea of defensive wars, of necessary wars, of the need for militarism, even of the need for a nuclear umbrella, etc. Absolutely, if I had to pick a person out of Ireland and a person out of the United States at random, who's going to be more likely to more agree with me? It's going to be Ireland. But there's plenty of work to be done, and we're actually working on getting some peace studies curriculum into Irish schools and various other projects in Ireland that we would love to work with you on if you're not already working with us. But it is extremely striking to me that, you know, you can tell people in the United States that police in another country don't have guns, and they won't believe you. How are they police then? What do they do to the bad guys? I mean, they talk and think in these cartoon terms, the bad guys. When I was in Russia a few years ago, I saw a police car pull a car over, and the guy get out of his car and run back and start yelling at the policeman, "Why'd you pull me over?" That guy would have been dead in my town. That guy would have been dead, right? You don't do that, right? And so it's a cultures, despite our vast similarities, and you know, can be wildly different, so different that people imagine the other one is impossible until they go see it. So virtually, you can't do it physically, but virtually, go see lots of other places.
Okay, another one from Facebook. This is from Terry Walker. We must divest from war to invest in green energy and agriculture to slow the effects of climate change. So what are we doing with that, David?
Well, it's absolutely right that war is one of the biggest, war and war preparations and militarism is one of the biggest causes of climate change. It's also arguably the most readily available, if not the only source of the amount of money needed to really push what some call a Green New Deal, an aggressive attempt to mitigate, to slow, if not stop, climate collapse and mitigate the damage. And so we really have no choice, for multiple reasons, to move the money from militarism to environment. And it's extremely popular. It's popular around the world. It's been popular in the United States for many years. If the United States had a democracy rather than, you know, wars for democracy, it would be happening. The question is, how do we make it happen? And one thing we've tried to do, I mentioned in my town and in others, is to bring a resolution to a government to take public money out of both wars and fossil fuels. That is, the biggest weapons makers, a list of the top 100 weapons makers, and a list of the top 100 fossil fuel producers, not consumers, but producers, and divest from both of those groups of companies together, and word the resolution, as you can find on our website, to spell out as an educational exercise for the public and the legislators while you do this, that it's one and the same issue, that you can't separate the war, the peace, and the environment. And Greta has been working on divestment more than any of us. But now that I've been in this retirement commission in this city, I've learned a lot of the bogus arguments against it and how to get around them and reply to them. So if you want to try it, talk to us.
Yeah, on that note, there was a question about, why is war bad for the economy? Is peace better for the economy? Can you kind of talk about that economic angle and also how war fuels more economic inequality?
Well, there isn't any question. Economists agree, and we put links to the best studies on this in, just about every related resolution or petition or action that we post at WorldBeyondWar.org. University of Massachusetts Amherst has done the best known studies, but there aren't really any that dispute the fact that investing dollars in education or green energy, et cetera, is better for an economy than investing in weapons and war. and that even just not taxing working people as opposed to the ultra rich in the first place is better for the economy than taxing them and spending the money on weapons and war. So it's actually a drain. It's a negative. And people are absolutely convinced and will go out in public and embarrass themselves announcing that it's a creator of jobs. And there's no disputing that there are lots of military jobs. The problem is just that there would be more jobs and better paying jobs and jobs you could sleep better after having performed if the money were spent otherwise. And this is to say nothing of the lost opportunity costs that economists will show you, what could have been done to vastly benefit economies over the years if you hadn't wasted it all on war. And it's to say nothing of the property destruction that every year around the world from wars is into the trillions. So economically, there's no question that we have to get off war. And I don't know how you even put into economic terms the impact of war on people whose houses and family members are blown up. What was the second half of this, Greta? Was
how war fuels more economic inequality.
Well, there isn't any question that that putting money into governments to put into militaries dramatically increasingly in recent decades has pumped that money into a smaller and smaller number of private corporations with a smaller and smaller number of people benefiting, and those at the top benefiting more and more and more in comparison with anyone else. And it's the least accountable way in which it's done, which, as far as we're able to tell, has the predictable result of being more in the direction of concentrating wealth than any other government spending. You have wealth concentrated to the point where the big corporations now are building their own militaries, which is a whole nother question. But public militaries are really instruments of private wealth expansion for the already wealthy.
Thanks. There was also a question about sanctions, and I know you mentioned it only briefly. Would you like to talk more about sanctions and whether you see sanctions as a form of warfare as well?
There are sanctions that people like to point to as having done good, in particular in South Africa with apartheid. And we have members of World Beyond War in South Africa who will tell you how unique that was, how different that was from the sort of sanctions that are imposed on countries around the world, including by the United Nations and including by the US government, which is imposing horrible sanctions and has been for decades on countries, including Iran, which is suffering horribly, and Venezuela and Cuba and North Korea and so on. And you don't have to take it from me or from anyone in Iran that these sanctions cause human suffering, that they are criminal violations of the Geneva Convention, that they are the imposition of collective punishment on a population. Members of the US government openly admit it. They want it. They celebrate it. They're openly sadistic in the way that I referred to briefly, that they now admit the wars are for oil, right? That you have Bolton saying you need a coup in Venezuela for the oil, and Trump saying you need troops in Syria for the oil, and Pompeo saying you need troops in the Arctic to get the oil as the ice melts, so we can melt more of the ice. And the sanctions on Venezuela are being imposed until such time as they have a coup, as they install an unelected president chosen by the US government, right? And so sanctions historically have often been not only cruel and deadly, but a planned step toward war. Now, you want to call sanctions war, I really don't care. I really have no interest in debates about the uses of words, but war understood as massive bombing, understood as shock and awe on Baghdad in 2003, the plan was to build up toward that with sanctions. And it was done to such an extent that, you know, you had Madeleine Albright, then Secretary of State, being asked if killing 500,000 children was worth it, whatever the hell worth it was. And she famously said yes. And I actually, you can look on my YouTube page and see me asking her more recently, was it worth it? And is it now worth it in Iran? And her saying, oh, yes, we must have sanctions in Iran. That's totally different. Well, now this week, even Madeleine Albright is against sanctions on Iran, right? I mean, this is like Hitler coming out against murder, right? This is, you know, this is how obvious it is to everyone now that you're imposing harsh punishments on ordinary people intentionally, willfully, to no good purpose. That you've got, you know, people across the political spectrum and past participants in the worst sanctions on earth opposing the sanctions, and the U.S. government going right ahead with the sanctions. They have to be ended, and not just because of the coronavirus, but certainly in addition because of the coronavirus.
Thanks, David. We have a lot more questions lined up. So there was also a question about World Beyond War's proposal for an alternative global security system. Can you talk more about the AGSS? In particular, the question was, who would run this alternative global security system?
Yes, well, this is a book that was put together by some of the people on this call. My own role was one part, a small part, and it really produced the thinking of experts across numerous fields. So it addresses how we get to a more peaceful culture, but it also addresses how we get to a more peaceful economy, or more peaceful legislature, or more peaceful criminal prosecution system, etc. And it lays out a number of alternatives, including how local and regional and national governments can improve their practices, but also how the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court can improve their practices, can be reformed in the direction of not just peace, but democracy, the two going pretty well hand in hand, or how they could be replaced, how you could replace the United Nations with something more democratic and more peace inclined. And so I take the comment from Greta. We have many more questions to be a nudge to shut up a little bit. So I tend to go at great length answering questions, but there are a lot of them. So if you want more about the AGSS, read it or ask me more after this call.
No, it's okay, David. I think you can keep going. We still have 30 minutes, so don't shorten your answer.
I meant shorten each one and do lots of them.
But I'll move on to the next one. So there was a comment from Tamara about NATO and opposing NATO. Can you talk a little bit about World Beyond War's work to call for the abolition of NATO?
Yeah, you know, NATO was understood as this organization of nations in a Cold War against another organization of nations called the Warsaw Pact, but that's long gone. And it was understood as, you know, this idea of defensive war that's been brought up on this call. It would defend certain nations against attack. That kind of started to go away when NATO was used as a means of getting the United States and allies into a war in the former Yugoslavia, where NATO served a particular purpose that is a small part of the harm NATO does, I think, but a particular purpose that it's served ever since in US discussions and that is the pseudo legalization of wars. Some people in the United States have this vague understanding that war is not legal, but it's very vague, and this understanding that, well, if some international body, maybe it's the United Nations, maybe it's NATO, I'm not sure, gets involved in a war, then it becomes legal. Well, we can argue about the United Nations, but that certainly is not true with NATO. And it's never true that a crime is less of a crime if you get a big gang together to commit it. But this is what NATO is a gang that you get together to commit crimes. And what we've seen with NATO has been this drive to exist, to find some basis for existing, some raison d'etre, and to expand. And of course, when Germany reunited, the United States promised Russia that NATO would not expand to the east. And of course, NATO has expanded dramatically to the east, right up to the border of Russia. So unlike what we call the Cold War, this new Cold War doesn't have any buffer zone. It's right on the border. And of course, Russia has, asked to join NATO, asked to join the EU, asked to push various disarmament policies, has asked to ban weapons in space and cyber war and so forth, and has been turned down at every stage. The Russian government has millions of flaws in its foreign policy and its war making and its domestic policies. But the real aggressor in this NATO-Russia relationship over the years has tended to be NATO, and you now have weapons aimed at Russia in nations right on the border of Russia, which is something you never had in the first Cold War, and the Russians understandably don't particularly like it. Speaking of the jobs from military spending, I've told this story before, but I wasn't even there. It's a video you can watch of a panel where Vladimir Putin was a speaker, and another panelist was a former U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, whose name I always forget, and I'll remember right after this call, or somebody can put it in the chat. But this former U.S. ambassador was asked by Putin, "Why all these missiles? Why all this threat?" And he said, no, Vladimir, you don't understand at all. This is not to do with threatening Russia. This is a jobs program for back in the States. And Vladimir Putin doesn't have the studies from UMass Amherst, but he at least has the decency to say, couldn't you have a different jobs program? But this is what NATO does. It pushes this conflict without which it ceases to have a reason to exist. It pushes this conflict with Russia so that you've had in recent years, and you were just starting to have when coronavirus scaled it back but didn't end it, the biggest war rehearsal exercises in decades in Eastern Europe on the border of Russia, with Russia doing its own war rehearsals to counter NATO's. And so you do have this weird phenomenon in US politics where people pretend that Trump is the enemy of NATO because of certain comments he's said that contradict other things he's done. And well, if Trump's against it, it must be good. So I'm for NATO. I don't know how to cure people of that without quite a long session. Maybe we should move to the next question.
Yeah, there's a question here about Russiagate, and what's your take on Russiagate?
God, well, with the latest proposal I've seen out of the Trump regime is to do away with this treaty that comes from back around 1992 maybe, that allows the US and Russia to fly reconnaissance, not bombing, but reconnaissance airplanes over each other's airspace to control that they're abiding by disarmament treaties to get out of this, just like the other hugely significant disarmament treaties that Trump has illegally and in violation of the very treaties pulled out of. And my immediate thought every time one of these things happens is, I wonder if the Russiagators are happy yet. Because taking, first of all, taking an electoral system in a country like the United States that is, corrupt up to its ears, that allows a loser to win through this thing called the Electoral College that bars people from voting for racist reasons, that is completely dominated by a corporate media that's completely bought and paid for, that you can't run as a candidate if you don't have billions of dollars, that has no verifiability of vote counting whatsoever, that is controlled by two political parties, that is just the the most rotten pretense of an electoral system, to take that and say it's been corrupted by this small number of weird ads on Facebook and so forth, is just bizarre. But to do it in a way that creates further animosity between two countries, the two countries that have the vast bulk of the nuclear weapons on Earth, to the point where the militaries aren't talking to each other anymore. The United States is building new, so-called more usable nuclear weapons. And then to take a guy like Trump, a guy who has imposed sanctions on Russia, sanctions on Russian individuals, threats and lies against Russia, rejected Russian proposals for peace in a half dozen countries, actually bombed Russian troops in Syria, stopped Russian energy, economic interests in Europe, just opposed Russia at each and every turn, and declare him Vladimir Putin's servant. And a traitorous enemy of the US public because he works for Vladimir Putin. I mean, it's just bizarre. And then to take a guy like Trump, who's just the quintessentially most impeachable person ever to hold public office in the United States, who could be impeached for wars, threats of nuclear war, profiteering in violation of the emoluments clauses of the US Constitution, instigating racist violence, locking up kids in cages separate from their families, declaring emergencies, misspending non-appropriated funds, just dozens and dozens of outrages and offenses, and go after him only for the most bizarre thing that you can't prove that because it's tied to Russiagate. And then to ruin impeachment, so that now you got, everybody spontaneously declaring he should be impeached for his conduct around the coronavirus, except that there's this understanding that they can't because they already impeached him for Ukraine, Russiagate, and it didn't work. I mean, if this is an opposition party to Trump, what need does he have of allies?
Okay. This is from Facebook. This actually is another question that touches upon U.S. Politics, but really in a way, this is world politics, because everything that's going on in the US certainly has a mostly negative impact on the rest of the world. This comes from Cat KB. Focusing on ending war itself, instead of tying it into other political issues such as the Green New Deal, would remove barriers to some US demographics, such as libertarians supporting you. So how do you react to that type of political observation, either for US or anywhere around the world?
Well, I'm friends with and appreciate the work of many libertarians on opposing war, right? If you're going to oppose everything, I'm going to agree with you on the bad things and disagree with you on the good things. And World Beyond War just opposes war. You can be a libertarian or not. You can be a socialist, communist, vegetarian, anarchist, whatever you want to be. If you oppose war, you agree with that pledge that I read that people have signed in 175 countries that says, I want to end all war. But when we talk with people about the various reasons to end war, there are going to be reasons that appeal to a lot of people that may not appeal to others. And if you talk about taking $1 trillion or some chunk of $1.25 trillion out of a government, to focus on the US government example, I've always proposed, why don't the libertarians get together with the socialists and cut out $100 billion for tax cuts for working people and $100 billion to put into a Green New Deal or some good program for human and environmental needs, and everybody wins. And the libertarians have always said, I'm sorry, I can't do it. As a matter of principle, I can't support spending money on anything. Even if the net result is spending less money on anything, I can't support spending money on anything. So it's been hard to get that sort of a compromise agreement to promote together. But to the extent that anyone can work together on something, I think we should. When we got my city council here in Charlottesville, Virginia, to pass a resolution against drones, we had people who support every war they've ever heard of, who support every drone murder or assassination around the globe you could imagine, but who don't want any drones spying on their window of their apartment, right? And you got people with their NRA hats and things that you don't usually see at a peace rally. You should have as big a coalition as you can have that can work effectively, even if it's uncomfortable. I think it's a reason not to make your campaigns about anything unnecessarily specific or anything personal. And libertarians who organize under the banner of Ron Paul or some other individual, just like people on the left who do the same, then bring in, anything that individual has ever done that somebody didn't like. So it is better to organize around the campaign, ban drones without any labels, any isms, any ideologies, or any individuals, and you get more people in.
Okay. Well, here's another question from Facebook. This is from Evan Dixon. What do you think of Gene Sharp's writings, such as on civilian-based defense?
Well, there are probably people more expert than I, even on this call. There are a lot of people who study it quite a lot, and rightly so. And I encourage it strongly and find his work extremely valuable. Now, that his work has been used toward bad and questionable ends, and that he himself has used his work toward questionable ends, there's no question. But somebody invented a hammer, and then we found out he beat his wife to death with the hammer. We wouldn't all stop using hammers and, push in nails with our thumbs. If somebody comes up with very useful tools, we should learn from them and expand upon them and try to figure out how to maximize their use toward good ends and minimize their use toward bad ends.
Thanks, David. The next question is about education. Can you talk a little bit more about World Beyond War's education campaigns? And the question specifically is, how can we get peace education into schools?
Great question, and very much a work in progress for us. Our education director, Phil Giddings, who's over in England, is not on this call as far as I know, or I haven't seen him and made him a host so he can talk. But you can talk to him about what we're doing and look at WorldBeyondWar.org/education. But we're not just doing these webinars. We're doing, for example, online courses. We have one starting up next week. And if you go to WorldBeyondWar.org, you can check it out. And it has a different instructor every week. It has written and video materials. It has optional Zoom calls, but otherwise you do it on your own schedule. And we found that people benefit tremendously, give us great positive feedback, which you can read there on that webpage, from these courses, and many then actually become more involved after taking these courses. But we also have been producing a lot of materials, including books, and getting those books into schools. And it's a question of talking with professors, talking with with teachers, talking with school boards, getting yourself invited and going and talking with students. You know, students, you poll them at the beginning of a session like this and they're all in the wrong place, and you poll them at the end and they're all in the right place. You know, how long that lasts with all of them, and can they be moved back by somebody else the next Tuesday? You know, I don't know, but it's extremely important to talk with young people, and extremely worthwhile and efficient. We've got a number of professors who've used some of our books, like A Global Security System, in their classrooms, who give us feedback on how wonderful it is. Our efforts are not just to update and improve these books and get them into more languages, but to get them into more classrooms. And so any questions or ideas or proposals you have in that regard, please contact Phil.
Great, and his email address is education@worldbeyondwar.org. All right, the next question, David, is what advice do you have for people outside of the U.S. who are being oppressed by U.S. militarism, whether that's, you know, wars being waged by the U.S. in their country, whether that's U.S. foreign military bases? How can those folks get activated, take action against U.S. militarism?
Well, when you start to see countries in Europe and the European Union violating U.S. sanctions on Iran, when you start to see countries attempting prosecution of U.S. criminals under universal jurisdiction or through the International Criminal Court, which has yet to actually prosecute any crimes in Afghanistan, for example, these are things that have to be advanced. When you see movements building to shut down U.S. military bases in countries around the world, these are steps that have to be supported. And when World Beyond War chapters and members in the United States can work together with those in other parts of the world where there's a U.S. war or where there's a U.S. base, that partnership can be quite powerful. And when we can get the whole world chipping in to help bring pressure on governments and through the media and through education around resistance to a war or to a base, it can be more powerful. I mean, this is why we started World Beyond War with the idea of it being global, representing and being run by the world, not a particular corner of the world. And so we have not just an organization that started in the United States, but an organization that has to address the U.S. military more than any other, because it's the largest and more active than any other. But we have to do this globally, and we're more powerful globally. And of course, I recommend the tools of nonviolence, education, and activist. And I highly recommend checking out WorldBeyondWar.org and seeing if there's a chapter near you. And if there isn't, talking with Greta Zaro, who's on this call, about how to start up a chapter with our help in your area, and then working with us from there.
Great. Yeah, and you can get in touch with me by emailing me. My email is simply my name, Greta, which is GRETA @worldbeyondwar.org. The next question, David, is about your book that you mentioned briefly about exceptionalism. Could you explain that concept a little bit more and how we can overcome it?
Very briefly, I can. I can't go through the whole book because it's a small book, but it's long to explain. You know, there's this notion in the United States that it's different, that it's better, that it's unique, that it's the one indispensable nation, and that it's the best. Number one, somehow it's better than all other nations at something or other. And of course, you know, so in the first section of this book, I tried to figure out if there's any truth to that. If there's anything that the United States is better than every other country at. And I couldn't find, you know, I could find negative things, right? It makes more war, does more environmental damage in some ways than any other country, more people in prison than any other country, land of the free, but I couldn't find anything good that the United States was better than every other country at. And so I look at where that thinking comes from and what it does to people's thinking and how it makes people think differently and superiorly toward people outside the United States, and the damage that it does in terms of acceptance of US wars and sanctions and cruelty, but also the damage it does to the United States. Prior to this pandemic we're in right now, the United States almost always turned down foreign aid, would rather have victims of Hurricane Katrina suffer or die than accept aid from outside the United States. That was beneath the United States. Now you have, aid from China and elsewhere coming into the United States. Maybe that's progress of a sort. But I look at a number of exercises and tools and mind games, mind experiments to how we can change the language we use, etc., for how we can start to undo exceptionalism. So, you take a collection of U.S. military bases like those in Okinawa, a very marginal and poor and small part of Japan, and imagine, that Japan has got all these military bases and they're all in Mississippi, and people in the government of Mississippi want them the hell out, but the U.S. government refuses. The Japanese rulers of the empire refuse. How would people in Mississippi, like people in Okinawa, start to think and talk about those bases? And how might that make us start to think and talk about the U.S. bases in Okinawa? To give an outline of one example.
Great, thank you. The next question is about nuclear weapons. Do you see nuclear weapons as a deterrent that can help prevent war? For example, in the case of North Korea, do you think that their nuclear weapons development program protects it from invasion?
Well, that remains to be seen. I think that unless the United States not only scales back or gets rid of its nuclear weapons, as it's legally obliged to do under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it's going to be obliged to do under the new treaty, and in addition, scales back or eliminates its aggressive behavior toward the rest of the world with non-nuclear weapons, it's going to be very hard to get countries to give up their nuclear weapons. When you see what countries that disarm, like Iraq or Libya, have happened to them, and you see, for whatever reasons, countries like North Korea not yet have that happen to them, it's going to be very, very hard to make that happen. But if the United States were just to get out of the way and allow the two parts of Korea to make peace and move toward reunification, you could see progress toward disarmament in both parts of Korea that are hard to imagine at the moment. And I think for the United States simply to formally end the war, to give up wartime control of the South Korean military, to allow families and businesses to reunite, and to allow Korea's future to be determined by Koreans, who knows what's possible then? It is certainly possible that North Korea would give up its nuclear weapons.
All right, the next question is about involving veterans in the anti-war movement. Can you talk about our efforts working with Veterans for Peace and the veterans that are part of the World Beyond War movement, and in general, how we can engage more veterans to get on board with anti-war activism?
Absolutely. I am not a veteran, but I am on the advisory board of Veterans for Peace, and consider Veterans for Peace one of the best anti-war groups in the US and UK and even Russia and other countries. It just has done tremendous work over the years and continues to. And we just, as World Beyond War, Greta, you and Mark just did a webinar with a member of About Face, another US-based veterans group. And I think it's absolutely critical that we partner with people who know war from the inside, can tell others about war from the inside, and can denounce the glorification of war as a service as precisely the people who are constantly being thanked for their so-called service. At the same time, we have to oppose that culture that thanks them and that treats it as a service. You know, I've been, every time there's a new mass shooting in the United States, it's usually by a veteran, and I'll add it to a running list I have, you know, of percentages that show that veterans, you know, so that a mass shooter in the United States is over twice as likely to be a war veteran than, you know, a random male of the same age. And I've found that story is just absolutely unacceptable in US media. That it's either it's understood as unpatriotic and anti-war and therefore unacceptable, or it's misunderstood as demonizing all veterans and inevitably creating prejudices against veterans, you know, that 99.9999% of whom, of course, are not mass shooters, just like everybody else are not mass shooters, or for whatever reason, it's unacceptable. And so I think asking, you know, trying to advance this shift toward treating somebody else as heroes. We've got banners up here, you know, thanking UVA doctors and nurses and calling them heroes. You know, there's so many people doing good work that we should call heroes. And we should call members of Veterans for Peace heroes, but not because they're veterans.
Okay, the next question, and perhaps the last, we have 3 minutes left, is what do you see as the biggest obstacle to peace, and how can we overcome that?
It's kind of hard to pick just one. I think the reason that I started this presentation with the emphasis on the possibility of ending war is because there's this huge obstacle consisting of the belief that it's impossible to end war. And it's not that if we convinced everybody it's possible, we would immediately succeed. I'm not predicting that we'll necessarily ever succeed. I'm not predicting that we'll fail. I don't have any crystal ball or magic powers. But if you could eliminate this belief that ending war is impossible, my God, we would have a much easier level playing field than this cliff we're trying to climb up right now. You know, so I would put that near the top of the list, along with, you know, the obvious other contenders of, you know, the financial profits and corruption and the bitter animosity and thirst for revenge that's created by wars that fuels future wars. And so, I mean, there's dozens of things you could put on a good list, but that's one of them.
Great. Well, we're just about out of time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. David, do you want to make a closing statement?
Well, I hope I didn't go on too long about each question and miss lots of good questions, but you can reach me at info@WorldBeyondWar.org, or David also works, David at WorldBeyondWar.org. You can find us on Twitter and Facebook. You can find us at WorldBeyondWar.org. You can get in touch with Greta about organizing in your area. You can get in touch with Mark about helping us out on social media and us helping you out. You can get in touch with Phil at WorldBeyondWar.org, or education@WorldBeyondWar.org. about our educational programs, and give us any feedback, including on this webinar. What did we miss? What's not convincing? What should we add? And give us any ideas on what we can work on together. And stay safe.